There's one single pedal that is essential to any guitar player, and that is the overdrive pedal. Now, a little bit about the history of overdrive pedals. Well, first of all, what is overdrive? Now, if you take an amplifier and you crank the thing up past its original parameters in which it's supposed to be designed in other words, a clean sound, you start to distort the tubes, if we're talking about a traditional old amplifier. And what happens is your guitar signal, which is a nice sine wave that goes up and down, when you push the amp really hard, it starts to clip. And I'm sure you've heard that terminology for clipping. What that means is at the top and the bottom, it starts to kind of get crunched or flattened out. So the sound that we really like for overdrive is a bit of a soft clipping. A hard clipping is almost like a square thing, would be a bit more like a fuzz sound, a fuzz face, a really kind of buzzy sound. And we'll talk about that later. But the standard overdrive pedal is really a nice soft clipping. Now, overdrive pedals, there's many of them out on the market, of course, as we know. The most famous one, I would have to say, is the Ibanez Tube Screamer. And many pedals are designed after the Tube Screamer. Let's talk about the parameters of the Tube Screamer, which is very similar to pretty much any overdrive pedal on the market. You might have a few tonal variations and things like that. Other pedals have different chips in them. They'll sound a little different. But the big daddy of all of them is the Tube Screamer. It was released in the late 70s and kind of a hit ever since then. Now, it was made famous primarily by Stevie Ray Vaughan. And if you're anything like me, you probably bought one at one point, plugged it in, turned it on, was really disappointed that you didn't sound like Stevie Ray Vaughan. Well, there's many reasons for that. One, and primarily, we're not Stevie Ray Vaughan, so I would say that's the main one. Secondly, you have to remember that Stevie was usually playing through an already distorted amplifier, one that was being pushed into overdrive. Not super heavy gain, but the amp was working the way we want it to. So you think about a classic Fender or Marshall where it's breaking up and sounding great by itself. Okay, so the parameters on a Tube Screamer are your basic sort of overdrive, which is the amount of gain you have or overdriven signal. And here's your tone knob, which of course adjusts tone. Now, it's not an active tone knob. It really just rolls off your high end if you go this way. Level is the output of the pedal. So right now I'm running through a clean amplifier, no effects or anything like that. Let me just play you my basic clean guitar sounds. I'm going to play a few chords. Just a basic clean sound, nothing going on, no reverb or anything. Okay, I have everything here about noon. I'm just going to kick on the pedal, hear what that sounds like. So you can hear it's doing as advertised. It's sounding like an overdriven amplifier. I think Tube Screamers are a really great sounding pedal. Now, one of the key things that made the pedal so popular, it's a little mid-heavy, meaning it adds mid-range to your tone. And that is especially excellent when you want to take a guitar solo. And that's usually what you're going to do when you have your Tube Screamer. You usually step on it for a guitar solo. The mid-range frequency pushes your tone above the band. It helps you cut through, because mids can be a little by itself, it may be a little harsh at times, but in terms of a band situation, it puts you right above the bass player and the drums, puts you right in that middle, so you poke right through. Now, a classic way to set a Tube Screamer into an already overdriven amp, there's a few ways. There's one where you're using it basically as a boost, and this is the most popular way I would say overdrives are used like a Tube Screamer. Your mileage may vary, but here's the way most people use it. If you're already running into an already kind of broken up amp, what we can do is turn the gain down for right now, and we can adjust that to taste, but we're going to crank the level. And what we're doing by doing this is pushing the front end of the amp really hard, so you're pushing it to where it distorts. So by pushing that front end, you're hitting the tubes really hard. You're overdriving, once again, clipping the input of the amplifier, and that usually gives us the sound we're talking about. So once again, a few chords on a clean. Now I'm going to kick that in. Okay, so we're not talking, earth-shaking distortion, and that's not what an overdrive is really for in a classic sort of situation. So now what I can do is turn up the overdrive. In that case, I'm going to get more clipping. my volume a little bit. Kind of cleans up nicely too. Okay, so there's more of the classic use of a tube screamer or an overdrive pedal. Now, the tone knob is really important here because that's going to really help you shape the tone of your signal. Now, if you're running into a very bright amp, or, well, this is the taste. I would usually run, and a lot of famous guys who are really famous for using the pedal, don't crank this too high. It can get very bright. Now, if I bring that back to noon, a little warmer in the sound. And depending what amplifier you're using, that you can adjust it to taste. So I'm going to set it to about 3 o'clock. Now, if you're using, say, like a Marshall style amplifier, this is a pretty mid-rangey pedal. Vaughn and guys who use a tube screamer a lot of times play through Fenders. Now, Fenders aren't usually as mid-range heavy. Say like a Deluxe or a Super Reverb are not super mid-rangey. Say like a Marshall 800, which is a fairly mid-rangey amp, and that's why it works so great in rock situations. So you want to pick and choose your overdrive depending upon the amplifier. So actually, I've got countless numbers of overdrive pedals that I think sound better with different amplifiers. Now, one thing we could do is crank up everything, and this is another way you can use the overdrive. Right there, it's getting a bit heavy on the low end for me. Now, that's something to talk about. Sometimes, if you're on that neck pickup and it gets a little flubby, one thing we can do, this is where the tone knob is extremely useful. So it can be very sensitive in those situations. I'm going to bring that gain back to where I had it and just bring up my tone a bit, and now it's going to tighten up that neck pickup. I'm going to bring it up even higher, the tone knob. So you see what happened by bringing that tone knob up a bit, I tightened up my low end. Now, the only thing you have to be worried about that was the neck pickup. When you go to your bridge pickup, it might be a bit bright, so you really have to figure out that cool middle ground. So that's something to really consider with the tone knob. I always recommend starting at noon and maybe going a little darker. That's especially if you're using sort of a Fender-style amplifier. General rules of thumb, if you're kicking up that gain more, you have a tendency to get some of those lower notes that are going to jump out and maybe get that flubby, farty sound that we try to avoid as guitar players, and that's where the tone knob can be very helpful as a tone-shaping tool to dial that into taste. Of course, your mileage may vary from what amplifier to amplifier you're using, but this is the general way when people talk about a tube screamer sort of sound, and this is the way you'd probably want to start approaching the use of an overdrive pedal.